The colony lay beneath the pale sky of a world that was both beautiful and cruel, a land of towering red cliffs, dry winds that carried the smell of stone and dust, and valleys where shadows grew long like secrets waiting to be uncovered. And in the heart of this land stood the settlement of the alien people, who for countless generations had lived with a burden passed down through the stories of their ancestors. A burden that whispered of a beast that could never be killed, a beast that demanded a life every time it rose from its cavern, a beast that the villagers called their curse and their god all at once. They had no choice but to obey, for whenever they refused in the old days, the beast had swept through their homes like a storm of hunger, tearing apart walls and lives alike, and so the custom of sacrifice was carved into their existence, repeated every few years when the ground trembled and the low roar of the monster echoed across the horizon. It was on such a day that the people gathered, their eyes downcast, their voices low, their hearts heavy with fear, and yet resigned to the rhythm of their tradition. And from among them, the elders had chosen the one who would be left for the beast this time, a young girl named Nera, her skin pale as moonlight, her hair a faint shimmer that caught the sun in silver strands, her eyes wide with both sorrow and defiance, though she dared not show it too openly. She had known this was possible, for every youth lived with the shadow of being chosen. But no thought or warning truly prepared her when her name was spoken by the elders' trembling lips, when the villagers turned their faces away and pretended not to hear her soft gasp, when the world around her seemed to lose all sound, except for the pounding of her own heartbeat. They dressed her in the ceremonial cloak, woven not as a sign of honor, but as a mark of surrender, and they bound her wrists with bands of braided fiber, not tight enough to wound, but strong enough to remind her she was no longer free. She walked with them through the dust path that led out of the settlement toward the barren flats where nothing grew. And though her legs wanted to fail her, she moved with quiet strength, because her pride would not allow her to collapse before those who gave her up. Around her the villagers whispered prayers that she could barely hear, prayers asking the beast to take her quickly, prayers asking for the safety of their own families, prayers that sounded like betrayal no matter how softly they were spoken. Watching all of this from a distance stood Daniel, a human soldier who had been stationed on this world as part of an Earth delegation meant to foster peace and learning between species. He had seen many things since arriving here, had learned the language of these people, had walked through their markets and eaten their strange foods, had even shared laughs with some of them. But what he saw now filled him with a cold anger that no training or diplomacy could suppress. He could not believe that in this age of technology and knowledge, in a world where even the stars were within reach, there were still those who clung to such cruelty, still those who believed that an innocent girl must be thrown away to keep a monster calm. Daniel's orders had been clear from the start. He was told to observe, but not interfere, to respect the customs of the colony even when they seemed strange or harsh, for Earth could not risk offending their hosts. Yet as he watched Nera being led into the wasteland, his hands clenched into fists, and his heart hammered against his ribs, because every part of him screamed that this was wrong, that no custom could justify such a thing, that if he turned away now he would be no better than those who lowered their eyes in silence. The crowd followed at a distance as the procession reached the flat ground where jagged rocks rose like teeth, and in the middle stood a stone pillar blackened by ages of sun and wind, the place where sacrifices had always been left. Nera was tied there, her cloak fluttering in the dry gusts, her eyes fixed on the horizon where the tremors of the earth were already beginning to stir. The villagers bowed their heads, some weeping quietly, others murmuring chants, but none daring to speak against what was unfolding. They believed the beast could never be slain. They believed resistance would only bring ruin. They believed fear was safer than hope, and so they obeyed. Nera stood still, though her heart felt like it might tear through her chest. And in that silence of waiting, she thought of the childhood she had lived, of the laughter she once shared with friends, now too afraid to meet her gaze, of the nights when she gazed at the stars wondering what other worlds might hold, of the quiet wish she once had, that maybe life could be more than fear. And now all of that seemed like fragments slipping away with every passing breath. Daniel's gaze never left her, and in that moment he realized that the decision was already made inside him, that no order or warning would chain him now, because the difference between standing still and stepping forward was the difference between being a soldier who watched and a man who acted, and he knew which one he would choose. The ground began to shake harder, a deep vibration that rattled the rocks and stirred cries of alarm from the villagers. And from the far end of the flats a roar rose like thunder, so loud it carried through the air and seemed to make the very sky shudder. The beast was waking, the ancient terror that ruled these people's hearts, and its shadow soon fell over the ground as it emerged from the canyon with scales like armor, and eyes that burned with a hunger older than memory. The villagers fell to their knees, pressing their faces to the dirt, chanting in desperate tones. But Daniel did not kneel. He stood tall, his hand resting on the weapon at his side, his breath steady even though the sight before him made every instinct cry out in fear. He saw Lyra lift her head, her eyes wide as the beast drew closer, and in her gaze he thought he saw not only fear but a faint spark of longing, as if in her final moments she wished someone, anyone, would defy the fate forced upon her. Daniel whispered to himself that he would not let her die like this, and though the crowd had no idea yet what he was about to do, though the elders believed their ritual was safe, though the beast roared with a fury that made the earth quake, the path of the story had already begun to change, because a single human heart had chosen to stand against the weight of an entire tradition, and from that choice nothing in this colony would ever be the same again. The roar rolled across the barren ground like the sound of mountains breaking, and the villagers pressed their faces into the dirt while their hands shook against the stones and their voices rose in frantic chants begging the beast to accept the offering and leave them unharmed. But Daniel did not bow his head nor move back, for his eyes stayed locked on the figure of Lyra, who stood bound against the black pillar, her cloak trembling in the wind and her breath coming fast as she stared at the monster that drew closer with every heavy step that made the ground shudder beneath her feet. The beast was unlike anything he had ever seen, even in his travels across strange worlds, for its body stretched longer than a starship, and its skin was a rough shield of dark scales that glistened under the pale light, its eyes glowing like fire in deep caverns, and its teeth sharp enough to crush stone with ease, while its breath steamed in the air with the smell of death and age, as if it carried the memory of all lives it had devoured across generations. Lyra could feel the sound of its growl moving through her chest, as though her very heartbeat was being stolen away, and she wanted to cry out, but her pride forced her lips to remain closed, and she lifted her chin to meet her fate with dignity. Even though fear was drowning every thought inside her mind, and even though her body longed to break free from the ropes that held her to the pillar. She had always known this day might come, but she never imagined the sight of the beast would be so overwhelming, nor that the silence of her people behind her would cut so deep like 1,000 blades, for not one voice had risen to say she should be spared, and not one hand had reached to stop what was happening. Daniel took a single step forward, and then another, his boots crunching against the dry earth, while his hand tightened on his weapon, and his heart beat louder with every moment, and though his training told him this was madness, and though his orders warned him not to interfere, he felt a strength rise inside him that was not born of duty, but of something deeper, a simple refusal to stand by and watch the innocent be destroyed. He remembered the way Lyra's eyes had looked when she had been chosen, and how she had walked with silent pride, though sorrow filled her, and he told himself that no human could be worthy of that pride if he stood still now. The villagers saw him moving, and gasps broke through their chanting, and some cried out in fear, telling him to fall back. telling him to bow, telling him that to defy the ritual was to bring destruction on them all. But Daniel did not stop, and when he reached the line of stones where the offering ground began, he lifted his weapon and fixed his gaze on the beast that had turned its burning eyes toward him as if it recognized the defiance that had not been seen in centuries. Lyra's heart leapt with confusion and shock as she saw the human stepping closer, for no one had ever dared to break the sacred law, and she could not understand why he would throw away his life for someone not of his own kind. Yet she felt something stir in her chest like a small spark of warmth, fighting against the cold of despair, and though she could not speak with the ropes biting into her wrists, she thought fiercely in her mind that she did not want him to die for her, even if it meant her own end. The beast lowered its head and released another roar that shook dust from the cliffs around them, and with a sudden burst of speed, it lunged forward, its massive claws ripping into the ground as it came for the pillar where Lyra stood. But Daniel moved without hesitation, diving across the stones and firing his weapon at the glowing eye of the monster, the shot exploding in light and striking deep enough to make the beast howl in pain for the first time in living memory. The villagers screamed in terror and disbelief, for never had they seen the beast hurt by mortal hands, and many turned to run while others collapsed in fear. But Daniel kept firing, each shot bursting against the armored scales, forcing the beast to stumble back, though its rage only grew more ferocious. In that chaos, Daniel reached the pillar, and with a swift slash of his blade, he cut through the braided cords that bound Lyra's wrists, and she fell forward into his arms, trembling with shock and confusion, yet alive and free for the first time since the ritual began. He lifted her quickly, urging her to move while the beast thrashed against the earth, its tail sweeping through the stones with the force of a storm, breaking walls and scattering the villagers who had thought their prayers could keep them safe. Together, Daniel and Lyra ran across the flats, their feet kicking up dust as the ground trembled behind them with the furious pursuit of the beast. And though fear filled them both, Daniel's grip on her hand was steady and unyielding, as if he carried not only her body but also her hope within his strength. The villagers cried out behind them, some shouting curses, others begging for the beast to turn away, but their voices were lost beneath the thunder of its roars as it tore after the fleeing pair, determined to reclaim the sacrifice that had been stolen from it. The wind whipped against Lyra's face, and she could hardly breathe for the speed with which they ran, yet she kept her eyes on Daniel's back and the determination in his stride, and for the first time in her life, she felt that perhaps fate was not unbreakable chains, but something that could be fought with courage and fire. Daniel shouted to her that they had to keep moving, that the cliffs ahead might offer shelter or ground high enough to slow the beast, and though she was weak from fear and shock, she forced her legs to keep pace beside him, for she felt that if she let go, now all hope would vanish. The beast slammed into the earth again and again, its claws gouging deep lines into the stone as it closed the distance, and the sound of its breathing grew louder and hotter until Lyra thought it was already upon them, but Daniel pulled her into a sudden turn, leading her into a narrow gorge where the high walls rose like towers on both sides, and the light dimmed above them, casting shadows that seemed to swallow the pair whole. The monster roared with fury at their escape path and crashed after them, shaking loose rocks from the cliffs. Yet Daniel did not slow, and in that rushing darkness Lyra clung to him and whispered through trembling lips that she did not understand why he had done this, that she did not understand why he had chosen her life over his orders or his safety, and Daniel answered in a voice steady despite the chaos that no life should ever be given to death without a fight, and that was reason enough. His words struck her heart with a force stronger than fear, and though the beast still hunted them, and though the gorge shook with its steps, something within her shifted like a door opening to a light she had never seen before, and she began to believe that this human who had risked everything might not only save her life, but change the fate of her people forever. The narrow gorge twisted ahead of them like the path of a serpent carved into stone, and every step echoed with the thunder of pursuit as the beast forced its way through the canyon, its massive body scraping against the walls, its claws shattering rocks while Daniel pulled Lyra forward, his grip never loosening even as his breath came hard and his muscles ached with the weight of battle and flight. The shadows of the cliffs fell heavy upon them, and dust clouded the air, but in that suffocating place where fear pressed close, Daniel kept his focus sharp and unyielding, because he knew that hesitation, even for a single heartbeat, would mean the end for both of them. Lyra stumbled more than once, her legs trembling from exhaustion and from the shock of all that had happened, yet each time she felt herself falling, Daniel's hand steadied her, and his voice cut through the chaos, urging her to keep moving, to keep breathing, to trust that there was still a way forward. And though she could hardly understand how he found such strength in the face of the beast, his words reached her heart like sparks of fire against the cold of despair. She had never seen defiance like his, for in her world people bowed before the terror without question, and the thought of fighting had always been dismissed as foolishness. But now, with every step she took beside him, she began to realize that what seemed impossible was only impossible because no one had dared to try. The beast bellowed again, and the gorge shook with falling stones, while its eyes burned with fury at the prey that refused to yield, and Lyra looked back for a moment to see the creature's vast jaws snapping shut on empty air just behind them. And the sight filled her with a fresh wave of terror that made her heart slam painfully against her ribs. Yet she forced herself to keep running, because the hand that held hers felt like an anchor to life, and she could not bear the thought of it slipping away. At last the gorge opened into a wider hollow where jagged spires of rock jutted from the ground, and Daniel slowed enough to pull Lyra behind one of the formations, his chest heaving as he searched for breath and for a plan, while the monster's growls echoed ever closer. The air was filled with dust and heat, and the sound of the beast's claws scraping across stone, and Daniel knew they had little time. But he looked at Lyra and saw her pale face streaked with dirt, her eyes wide with both terror and wonder, and he felt a surge of determination stronger than any order or training. Lyra leaned against the rock, her body trembling, yet her mind filled with questions that pressed against her lips until they finally spilled out, and she asked him why he had done this, why he had chosen to fight when her own people had abandoned her, why he had risked his life for someone he barely knew, and someone not even of his own kind. Her voice shook as she spoke, but the depth of her confusion and her need to understand made her words strong enough to rise above the sound of the beast's hunting cries. Daniel met her gaze, and though his breath still came hard, his voice was calm and steady when he told her that no life deserved to be thrown away like an offering to fear that no ancient custom could justify, the death of an innocent, and that if no one else would stand against such cruelty, then he would, because that was what it meant to be human, to stand when others bowed to protect, when others surrendered to fight even when the world said there was no hope. His words were simple, yet they struck her with a force greater than any weapon, for they revealed a truth she had never known, that courage was not only for legends, but could live within anyone who chose not to look away. For a moment the terror around them seemed to fade, and Lyra's heart beat with something new, a warmth that rose from within her chest and spread through her veins stronger than fear, and she realized that what she felt was not only gratitude, but also an awakening of hope, the kind of hope her people had long forgotten. And she knew that even if the beast devoured them in the next breath, the truth of what this human had shown her would remain alive within her forever. The ground shook as the beast forced its way into the hollow, its massive form filling the space with darkness and rage, and Daniel pulled Lyra back further into the rocks, his mind racing for a way to slow the creature even for a moment. He spotted loose boulders high above them where the cliff walls narrowed, and he realized that a well-placed shot might bring them down upon the monster to buy them time. He lifted his weapon and aimed carefully despite the shaking of the ground, and with a burst of light, The shot struck the stone and sent a cascade of boulders tumbling down onto the beast's head and shoulders. The impact roared through the hollow, and the creature shrieked with pain and fury, thrashing against the rockfall as clouds of dust rose into the air. Daniel seized the moment and pulled Lyra through a narrow gap between two spires leading into another passage, where the shadows swallowed them from view. They ran again, their feet striking the stone in frantic rhythm, their lungs burning with effort, yet neither of them slowed, because behind them the monster's roars promised relentless pursuit. As they moved deeper into the twisting paths of stone, Lyra's mind spun with the storm of all she had seen and felt. And though fear still gnawed at her, she found her thoughts returning again and again to Daniel's words, and to the fierce light in his eyes when he spoke them. She realized that this man carried within him a strength not born of size or weapons, but of conviction, and she felt drawn to that strength as if it were a beacon in the endless dark. She thought of how he had cut her free, how he had lifted her from the pillar, how he had looked at her, not as a sacrifice or a burden, but as a life worth saving, and the weight of that truth filled her chest with a strange new ache that was not sorrow, but something she could not yet name. Daniel noticed the way she watched him even as they ran, and though he kept his eyes forward, he felt the meaning of that gaze pressing on him like a silent question, and he wondered if she understood that his choice had not been made out of duty alone, but from a deeper instinct, that no soldier could deny the instinct to protect life, no matter whose it was. He did not know what tomorrow would bring, or even if they would live through the next hour, but he knew that he could not have done otherwise, and for that knowledge he felt no regret. The hollow gave way to an open stretch of cracked earth, where the cliffs widened into the barren flats, and though the beast still roared behind them, its sounds had grown fainter, as if the rocks had slowed its chase for a time. Daniel slowed his pace, allowing Lyra to catch her breath, and together they stood in the dying light of the strange sun, their bodies weary, yet their spirits strangely alight with something more powerful than exhaustion. She looked at him with eyes that trembled between fear and wonder, and he looked back with a steadiness that promised he would not let go. And in that silent exchange a bond began to take root, deeper than either of them had known before. The horizon stretched endless, and the future remained uncertain. But in that moment, they were no longer a soldier and a sacrifice. They were two lives bound together by defiance and hope, running not only from a beast but toward a truth that could change the fate of a people, and perhaps even the destiny of a world. The sun sank lower in the strange sky, turning the barren land into a canvas of blood-red light and long shadows that stretched like claws across the cracked ground, and though the beast had been slowed by the falling rocks, its pursuit did not end, for its roars still rolled through the air like storms breaking mountains, and each sound reminded Daniel and Lyra that their struggle was not yet over, and that the monster would not rest until it had reclaimed what it believed was its rightful prey. They moved quickly across the flats, their bodies weary, yet driven by the fierce knowledge that stopping meant death, and as the heat of the day faded into the cool breath of evening, Daniel searched the horizon for anything that might give them a chance to fight, rather than simply flee. In the distance he saw the outline of jagged cliffs rising higher than those they had passed before, and he knew that within those walls there might be ground narrow enough to trap the beast, or to force it into a place where it could not use its size to crush them. He pointed toward it, and urged Lyra forward, his voice steady, though his lungs burned with every breath, and she nodded without question, following his lead with trust that had grown stronger with each moment of their shared flight. She no longer looked at him as a stranger, nor even as a soldier from another world, but as the one who carried light into her darkest hour, and that thought gave her strength, even when her body begged her to collapse. Behind them the beast broke free of the gorge, with a roar that shook the flats and sent flocks of winged creatures bursting into the sky, its massive body surging forward with relentless fury, its claws tearing deep scars into the ground as it closed the distance. The sight of it rising against the horizon was enough to make even the strongest heart quail, but Daniel's grip on his weapon tightened and he quickened his pace, dragging Lyra with him toward the cliffs where he hoped to make his stand. The ground trembled as the monster drew near, and stones cracked beneath the force of its steps, until the very air seemed to vibrate with its rage. Lyra glanced back once, and the sheer scale of it filled her with terror, yet she forced her eyes forward again, because she knew that, if she let fear control her, she would stumble and fall, and she refused to become a burden to the one who had already risked everything for her. Instead, she held to the sound of Daniel's voice, as he shouted that they were almost there, almost to the rocks, almost to the place where they could fight not as prey running from death, but as lives standing against it. They reached the cliffs just as the beast closed upon them, and Daniel pulled Lyra into a narrow crevice where the rock walls rose like towers on either side. The path was tight and winding, too small for the creature's full body to force its way through at speed, and Daniel saw in this a single chance. He turned to Lyra, his eyes steady and fierce, and told her they must set a trap that together they could make the monster fall if they used the land itself against it. She stared at him with fear and doubt, yet when she saw the fire in his eyes, she felt courage stir within her, and she nodded, saying that she would follow his lead wherever it carried them. They moved quickly deeper into the cliffs until they found a place where great spires of stone leaned precariously above the path, their bases cracked by time, their weight balanced only by the narrow ridges that held them. Daniel studied the formations and realized that with enough force, those spires could be toppled to crush even a creature so large. He explained his plan to Lyra, that they must lure the beast into the passage and at the right moment bring the rocks down upon it, and though his voice was calm, she could hear the strain beneath it, for he knew the risk was enormous and their margin for error thin as a blade's edge. The beast forced its head into the passage, its jaws snapping with hunger, its eyes glowing with fury, and the sound of its breath echoed like thunder through the narrow space. Daniel fired at its face, drawing its rage upon him while he shouted for Lyra to move toward the far side, where she could reach the weak ridges that held the spires in place. She ran as he told her, her heart hammering her steps, stumbling against the uneven ground, yet her will carrying her forward, because she knew that if she failed, now all was lost. The monster lunged deeper into the passage, its body grinding against the stone walls while its claws scraped sparks from the rock, and Daniel dodged its snapping jaws again and again, firing shot after shot into its eyes and throat, though each wound only seemed to enrage it further. The ground shook as it thrashed against the walls, its massive tail lashing out and striking the stone so hard that shards flew like knives around him, but still he held his ground, because every moment he kept its attention was another moment for Lyra to reach her goal. Lyra climbed the ridge, her hands bleeding from the sharp stone, her breath tearing in her lungs, and when she reached the cracked base of the largest spire, she pressed her body against it, pushing with all her strength, though the stone groaned but did not move. She cried out in frustration and fear, but then she remembered Daniel's words that courage was choosing to stand even when the world said there was no hope, and with a desperate cry she pressed again, using not only her body, but her will, her heart, her very soul. The rock shifted a fraction, and then another, and she felt it begin to give way. Daniel saw the spire tremble and shouted for her to push harder, for the beast was almost upon him, its jaws snapping inches from his chest, and the heat of its breath burning his skin. He braced himself against the wall and fired his last shot directly into the glowing eye of the monster, and for a moment, the world seemed to freeze as the beast howled with pain, thrashing violently against the narrow passage. With one final surge of strength, Lyra shoved the ridge loose, and the great spire tore free from its place, crashing down with the force of a falling mountain. The sound roared through the cliffs as stone struck flesh, and the beast was crushed beneath the weight of the collapsing rocks, its scream echoing until it was drowned by silence and dust. Daniel staggered back, his body trembling, his weapon empty. His breath ragged, yet his eyes searching for Lyra, and when he saw her clinging to the ridge with tears streaking her dust-covered face, he felt relief so fierce it nearly broke him. He rushed to her side, lifting her down from the rocks, holding her against him as the dust settled around them. And for the first time since the nightmare began, they stood in stillness, with no roar, no pursuit, only the sound of their own hearts beating together. Lyra looked into his eyes, and in that gaze was more than gratitude, more than relief. It was the birth of something deeper. Something that had taken root in the fire of battle and the defiance of fate. She whispered that he had saved not only her life but her soul, and Daniel answered quietly that she had saved him too, for without her courage, he could not have stood against the beast alone. The cliffs around them lay broken, and the beast lay buried beneath the fallen spires, and in that ruin, the truth became clear that the terror which had ruled her people for generations was not unkillable, not untouchable, but only a monster of flesh that could fall when courage stood against it. The dust settled slowly over the broken cliffs, and the silence that followed was heavy like a weight pressing down on the land, where moments before the roars of the beast had shaken the skies. Daniel stood still for a long while, his chest rising and falling with each heavy breath, his hand steadying Lyra as she leaned against him, her body trembling, yet her eyes wide as she gazed at the place where the monster lay, buried beneath the shattered stone. For generations her people had believed it was eternal, that nothing could wound it, that no one could ever stand against it, and yet here in this moment, the proof lay before her that even the mightiest terror could fall when courage refused to bow. The echoes of the battle carried across the flats, and soon figures appeared at the mouth of the cliffs, the villagers who had fled now creeping back, their faces pale with fear and disbelief, their eyes darting between the human who still held his weapon, though it was empty, and the girl they had offered as sacrifice, now alive and standing beside him. Whispers spread among them, voices trembling with awe as they tried to understand what they were seeing, some insisting it could not be real, that the beast could not be gone, while others cried that the ancient order had been broken, that the world itself might collapse without the ritual, yet none could deny the silence that lay where once the monstrous cries had ruled. Lyra stepped forward, her cloak torn and her skin streaked with dirt, but her voice clear as she called out to her people, telling them to lift their heads and see the truth with their own eyes, that the beast had been slain, and that the life they had lived in fear no longer held chains upon them. Her words carried across the hollow with strength, born not from tradition, but from the fire that had grown in her heart, beside the human who had shown her another way, and the villagers listened with wide eyes, for they had never before heard one of their own speak so boldly against the old laws. Daniel stood beside her silent, yet his presence alone spoke volumes, for they all saw the human who had done what no one among them had dared, who had risked his life, not for glory, not for power, but to save one girl abandoned by her own people. In his stance they saw defiance, and in his eyes they saw the reflection of a truth that their ancestors had buried beneath fear, that courage was stronger than ritual, and that the chains they had carried for ages were only as strong as their belief in them. The elders stepped forward, their faces shadowed with shame and doubt, for they had been the guardians of the custom, and now their power trembled in the face of what had happened. They tried to speak of anger, claiming the balance of the world might be broken, that without sacrifice the beast's curse would return, but their voices faltered as the crowd turned not toward them, but toward Lyra and Daniel, standing together at the edge of the ruins. For the people could see with their own eyes that the curse had been nothing more than flesh and bone, a monster that bled and fell like any other, and the truth once seen could not be silenced again. Lyra's heart swelled as she saw the faces of her people shifting from fear to wonder, and then slowly to hope, and she realized that though the beast had fallen, the greater victory was the breaking of the chains that bound their spirits. She turned to Daniel, her eyes shining with emotion, and she whispered that he had not only saved her, but had given her people back their future, and he answered quietly that it was not his gift alone but hers as well, for without her strength and courage, the fight would have been lost. As the villagers gathered around, many dropped their heads, not in worship, but in respect, to the two who had stood against the impossible, and though no words of thanks were spoken in that moment, Lyra could feel the shift in the air, as if the colony itself breathed for the first time without fear. Children peeked from behind their mothers' robes with eyes full of questions and wonder, and old men who had once spoken only of survival now murmured that perhaps a new life was possible, one not bound to blood and sacrifice but to courage and hope. The night fell over the land with a sky full of stars burning bright above them, and Daniel stood beside Lyra, watching the villagers return slowly to their homes, their voices carrying softly on the wind as they spoke of what had been lost and what might yet be built. He felt the ache in his body from every wound and every desperate step, yet he also felt a quiet peace settle within him, for he knew that in choosing to act, he had changed not only one life but many, and that the echoes of this day would ripple across generations. Lyra moved closer to him, her hand brushing against his as though drawn by a force she could not resist, and when their eyes met, there was no need for words, for she knew that what she felt was not only gratitude, but something deeper, something that had grown in the fire of battle and the silence of trust. She saw in him the courage that had broken fate, and she felt in herself the heart that had answered that courage with her own strength, and together they stood in the starlight, not as sacrifice and savior, but as equals, bound by something greater than fear. She told him softly that her heart belonged now to the one who had shown her that chains could be broken, and he looked at her with steady eyes and said that he had only done what was right, yet in the warmth of his voice she felt the same unspoken bond that filled her chest with a new and unfamiliar joy. In that moment the colony around them seemed to fade away, and all that remained was the promise of a future where fear no longer ruled, and where two lives from different worlds could walk side by side towards something unknown yet beautiful. The ruins of the beast lay silent beneath the cliffs, and the stars burned above as witnesses to the dawn of a new chapter in the life of a people long bound by terror. Lyra lifted her face to the sky, her hand still entwined with Daniel's, and for the first time she felt the night not as a veil of sorrow, but as a canvas of hope. She knew that the road ahead would not be easy, that doubts and fears would return, that her people would struggle to learn a new way of living, but she also knew that the first step had been taken, and that the memory of this day would never fade. Daniel looked at her with quiet pride, knowing that the courage which had carried them through the fire would carry them further still, and in his heart he felt the simple truth that had guided him from the start, that no life was meant to be given to death without a fight. Together they turned from the ruins, walking slowly back toward the settlement, where voices waited to greet them, not with chants of fear, but with cautious hope. And as they walked side by side beneath the endless stars, the story of sacrifice had ended, and the story of freedom had begun. The end.